decentralization is a spectrum, and it's actually on different verticals, right? So if you think of decentralization, there is decentralization of course from a technology perspective, right? So for example, number of validators that you have, how is that decentralized? There's of course also decentralization in terms of like decision making. How is that decision being made? There's also decentralization of like funding. Well, where is the funding, and actually how does that happen? So there is basically decentralization on a bunch of different criteria, and I could keep going on.
About our current financial system.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of NEWFORUM, where we bring you awesome creators, founders, and visionaries from the Web3 space. And on today's episode, I'm super honored because we have Marieke Flament with us, CEO at NEWFORUM. And Marieke is a French-born computer engineer who has worked across the globe in a diverse range of companies such as LVMH, Boston Consulting Group, Expedia, Hotels.com, and also Circle. And I'm really excited because we're going to dive deep into Marieke's journey with NEAR and also start talking a bit about protection and user data and privacy in Web3. Hi, Marieke.
Hello, hi, super great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we're super honored to have you here. And Marieke, I would love to know, how did you get started with your story in crypto and your background? I know you worked for LVMH and Circle, and how did you come to NEAR then in the end?
Yeah, look, great question. So by background, I'm a computer science engineer. I actually finished my studies in China. And at the time when I was looking to stay in China and to work there, I found a job at LVMH. So I would say it's more by actually chance that I started my career in the luxury good industry, but I started like in the IT department. Anyway, long story short, after doing that, I stayed a couple of years in Asia, did different roles. Then I did an MBA at London Business School back in London because I needed to retrain myself and to learn about business. Then I worked in strategy because when you do an MBA, very often that's what you want to do. So that's what I did. And after a couple of years in strategy consulting, I worked at Expedia. And it's when I was at Expedia working for Hotels.com that I got a call from a headhunter actually telling me about this startup in Bitcoin. And my first reaction was like, sorry, I think this is the wrong number. I'm not working for drug dealers, because in my mind at the time, that was the headline that you were seeing on like Bitcoin, right? Because the entire industry was like the Bitcoin industry. Anyway, long story short, the headhunter insisted and I started reading about the company, and I was extremely lucky because that company was Circle. So it was actually, Sean and Jeremy, the co-founders of Circle, had actually done other companies before, and they were vetted, entrepreneurs, and the board that they had and the funds that they raised and the vision of all that was actually amazing. So that's how I got into crypto, and that was the end of 2015. So I would say, it took me courage to deep dive into it and to feel that I could go into entrepreneurship, because that's what it was at the time. It was not the size that Circle is today, but there is not a day when I never regret that decision, because actually it opened my eyes on what is actually blockchain, what's the technology, and what can happen. And then if we fast forward, after that, I was at Circle until early 2019, and then after that, I had the opportunity to become the CEO of a neobank in the UK, which is owned by NatWest, and the neobank is called Metal. And I thought, okay, it's actually a great opportunity to also see the other side of what's happening.
Wow, it's such an inspiring story, you're coming from I would say more traditional background, and as a woman being headhunted down then to becoming the CEO of NEAR in the end, and it's really inspiring. And now I want to ask you, what are kind of the challenges with overseeing such a complicated space sometimes, as a CEO?
Yeah, many actually. So one, when you work at a traditional corporate, in a way it's easier because you have a top down, right? And decisions come from a place, and then you implement them with more or less success, but at least you have some sort of corporate structure in an ecosystem, which is actually permissionless, because anyone can decide to build anything, whether it's actually on NEAR as a layer 1 protocol or actually on NEAR as a blockchain operating system. Anyone anywhere in the world can decide to build whatever they want. And then what that means is that, giving some sort of direction or coordination or actually working with that, it constantly feels like a catch-up game. So I would say the flip of actually what it means to help an ecosystem have what it needs is quite different. My role is much more, how do I serve? how do I serve, what is missing, what are the blocks that are missing, what are the conversations that need to happen with others. So it's actually not a role of leading, but it's a role of like, coordination and thinking through what is it that others need so that they can become successful. The other thing I would say as a challenge is there are two other challenges. One, as an industry, we are evolving so fast. So it's incredible, like the speed at which it goes. When I look at first steps in 2015, and when I look at where it is today, like it's night and day. And even when I look at, from one week to the other, there is not a week when there is not like some sort of new products or new way of doing things that is actually emerging. So keeping up is actually not easy. Keeping up within our ecosystem, but then keeping up with the broader industry. And then the third challenge, I would say, and I think it's something probably very attuned to 2023, is just being able to understand and navigate what's happening in terms of regulation, right? We are definitely seeing a lot of big moves out of the US. We're also seeing equally very big move, but very innovative and opening up in Europe, and the same in Asia, right? So keeping abreast of like what's happening, what's the global agenda, what does it mean actually for the ecosystem, for the industry, and all that, I think is challenging. I would say heads down is never, that's pretty the hardest job I've ever had, but the most intellectually and challenging and demanding in a way that I feel every day I'm learning, every day I can, help contribute to something and have an immediate impact on what's happening.
Yeah, you rise up to the challenge, it looks like. And like you said, there's so much happening, not only within the crypto space, but also in the global economy. And it's hard sometimes to catch up with everything that is going on every day. And let's talk more about NEAR. I want to know like what does NEAR actually like stand for, and how does NEAR approach kind of like building we always love to talk about the decentralized graph or the open graph, and how does NEAR solutions approach kind of like, being a layer one and the decentralized graph?
Yeah, so maybe I'll actually start by the history of how NEAR came about, because I think it's actually extremely relevant, specifically like today in the place and shape where we are. So NEAR actually started as an AI project, and the name NEAR is because singularity is near. That was the name. And the first idea of Alex and Ilya, the co-founders, was to say, well, imagine a world in which you can have, led by AI, a way to create any program and any actually interface that we would imagine. So that was the first idea. And to do that, they actually had access to a bunch of, projects and people across the world that were helping them build that vision. And they needed to pay those people. And they thought, okay, we heard about blockchain, so let's use blockchain to pay those contributors across the world. And when they started, they realized that actually it was super slow, it was super expensive, and it was just not working. So they thought, okay, hold on, let's change track and let's maybe fix that first problem. And to do that, they did a bunch of whiteboard series with all the different layer ones that were existing at the time. It's actually available on YouTube, highly entertaining, especially for people who are very technical. But they did a bunch of whiteboard series with all the founders of other projects to try to understand what's working where and what's not working. And then they took basically the best bits and pieces of all that. And I said, okay, if we take this part from there and this part from that, then we can actually create a layer one that is extremely scalable, super fast, super cheap, and actually very usable. And so that's the premise of actually the origin story of NEAR. So at the core and the heart, NEAR started as a layer one protocol, which is proof of stake, which is actually sharded, which is extremely usable for end users. So since day one, you actually, you can have account abstraction, which is extremely handy for having Web2 companies who can actually come on behalf of their users actually to have what's needed. But you can also have accounts that are actually human readable. So that's also very handy for mass adoption. And not only that, but you can code as a developer in Rust and Solidity, but also in JavaScript, because everything is actually WebAssembly based. So that the premise of that has been built. And now, as we go into 2023, we are actually evolving into what we call a blockchain operating system. Because not only do we have the layer one as one of the fundamentals, but we also have actually the dev tooling that is needed, and we're also able to actually have the front end that is needed to actually enable more people to build, but also enable what you call the open graph, which is how do we get users to be able to really port their data and what they create, whether it's on this portal or another portal or another portal. And so we released in Denver 3 weeks ago now, something that we call the blockchain operating system, and its front end, which is alpha.near.org. And on that, you can see what I think are really the premises of what we call an open graph, which is how developers can, truly play Lego blocks and start building widgets that build on each other and use what others have done, and how as users we can actually say, well, this is my identity, this is actually, the data, the stuff I create, and actually what I want to be represented at, and I can port that into that portal, and so on and so forth. So that's a little bit of our story, and that's how we think about it, and how we are basically getting to building this open graph that you talk about, which is truly enabling users to own their data, their governance, and what they do wherever they actually are going.
Yeah, I think this is super interesting because you kind of have these different things that are in place. Also, I want to quickly mention Aurora, which is like the EVM, right? And there you build a bunch of connections with, for example, Arweave, the graph. How does this play in hands with what you just talked about?
Aurora started also as an EVM, which again, if you think of like adoption in particular for developers, well, it might be that, developers have developed something great on maybe Ethereum, but actually what they need is an underlying chain that will go faster, will be cheaper. And so without having to recode everything, then they can actually port that and have that benefiting from what Near is doing, but ultimately being built in the code that they know. So that's one of the first true force for Aurora. And Aurora continues to evolve as actually a separate project within the Near ecosystem. And that separate project has also recently announced something that's called Aurora Cloud, because one thing we are seeing is that, let's imagine you're an enterprise, you need to have some sort of certainty on actually, well, what's going to be the consumption that you're going to have, right? So if you actually plug your users on it, well, how much, resources and therefore how much tokens are you going to need to lock in to be able to understand what you're doing, right? So the way we think about Aurora is that as other key projects that are infra or integration within the Near ecosystem, we do have some of those that are doing different parts of the ecosystem, and Aurora plays this unique, very important role of actually EVM, but also providing more transparency and more visibility, for example, for projects who actually want to maybe not have to recode everything that they've done, but still benefit from the economic benefit of being on Near.
This makes a lot of sense if you are a project who don't want to do from scratch kind of building, but you want to plug into the ecosystem. And I think that it really makes a lot of sense for me. I know there's something called Near Guilds. I'm not sure if this is still active, but I would love to know like how you guys do governance and how Near runs. Is it a DAO? Is it in guilds? I would love to know.
Yeah, great question. So we've evolved that model quite a bit, right? So a couple of years back, indeed, you had guilds that were actually formed around different like themes. So for example, you can have a guild that is around gaming, right? So everybody that's interested in gaming can actually go around that, or a guild that is actually focused on maybe DeFi and so on and so forth. Some of our guilds have evolved into being much more structured. So for example, for everything related to DeFi, we have an ecosystem fund that actually is called Proximity. And so Proximity is actually the place that looks after everything related to DeFi. Some have still stayed guilds. So for example, Human Guild is a guild of people who actually are interested in gaming. I would say the biggest step forward that we've done in terms of governance for the Near ecosystem is what we call the Near Digital Collective. Here's the big picture where we're trying to get at. Decentralization is a spectrum, and it's actually on different verticals, right? So if you think of decentralization, there is decentralization of course from a technology perspective, right? So for example, number of validators that you have, how is that decentralized? There's of course also decentralization in terms of like decision making. How is that decision being made? There's also decentralization of like funding. Well, where is the funding and actually how does that happen? So there is basically decentralization on a bunch of different criteria, and I could keep going on, right? Like for example, from a brand perspective, like who makes decisions and so on and so forth. So what we had actually a community group come together last year and say, well, if we wanted to decentralize more of the treasury and actually be able to say, how do we incentivize people in the ecosystem, but also make sure that we have a transparent way for the ecosystem to decide where a fund is spent, how would we do that? And so last week, the Near Digital Collective announced that they actually created a trust instrument, which is completely public, and it has actually members in that public trust, and that a public trust has funding, so it's like a treasury And then that treasury can be assigned then to different DAOs. So for example, the DAOs that we have at the moment, we have a marketing DAO. We have actually a community creative DAO, which is like for anything that's related to creators, NFT projects and things like that. And then we have a developer governance DAO, which is related actually to every infrastructure bits and so on and so forth. And the idea for us is to say, well, if there is this, movement of community, which by the way has a constitution, has a way to vote, has a way to actually have funds that are safeguarded, has a way to be very transparent on where funds are going and what's being voted on, then that's a way where the community can truly take on more and more, and then we can continue our journey on decentralization. So that's how we think about it. I think we've made quite a lot of progress in 2022, and I'm actually personally really excited to see what is the next steps and how, for example, this new digital collective of community member is taking things and continue to evolve.
That's really interesting. I would love to know, is there kind of a delegate system, or how does the voting kind of mechanism works? Because I talk with a lot of people who are working in the DAO structures, and it's always fascinating to me to know how these voting systems work or not work for them. And yeah, I would love to know how the kind of DAO structure is.
Yeah, great question. So at the moment, and maybe it's not the idea, but at the moment, every DAO has its own way of voting. And I would say we see a little bit from everything, right? We see some DAOs where it's few members that are very active and actually that we, will take charge to propose things and to be motors. We do have a governance forum. So for some DAO, it's actually, that's the place where things are publicly being listed. So I would say two things. One, our tools are not homogenized because again, it's community DAO, they're created from scratch by community members. So the tools are not necessarily the same everywhere. And two, actually how the governance within certain DAO is also not the same. The dev governance is probably one of the best example we have, which is a community at the moment of self-nominated people. Then there is actually a board that's completely transparent, and then there's a voting system for that for things to pass through. Work in progress. Same as maybe talking about DAO. Actually, another example we have is. We partnered with SailGP, which is a sailing competition. And SailGP recently announced that there is now a DAO that's been structured for actually taking ownership of a fully fledged professional sports team and to do that. And it's hundreds of pages, the document of actually what the proposal for that DAO is to operate. But there's been a ton of thinking put through, well, if a DAO is a team, then, who are the managers of the team, right? And therefore, how do you do that? And then who are the people who can participate and vote? And I think it's this balance between, people who are full-time in because it's a job, and therefore you need someone to push things forward and to do the job and operate. And then decisions and votes, when and how is that most relevant to vote?
Yeah, it's how do you define the roles and how much you let go of the roles? And, how also, if you have a lot of, let's say, stake within the token, then you automatically have a lot of votes. So it's a very interesting space to navigate. I want to know more about how do you guys approach security and privacy? So how do you design for privacy amongst the users and developers? For us at NEWFORUM, we talk a lot about social capital, you have your online identity, you have it all over the net, and you not necessarily are in ownership of your data, of all your interactions, and you're also not always secure. So how do you NEAR approach kind of designing this protocol?
Yeah, so actually a lot of things. So at the core and heart, owning your data and owning what you create, that's the core of actually, why NEAR exists, and I think why a lot of us are actually in Web3. In terms of, privacy, we are actively exploring things such as ZK technology and things like that. So, for example, the DevGov has a whole stream of work that's happening on that front because we think that's the next frontier, right? So to be able to say, I match those criteria, but I'm not revealing who I am and therefore I can pass through. I think that opens up a lot of things. It opens up, honestly, also a lot of possibilities for even TradFi and DeFi. So I think that's a really core key component of that. In terms of thinking through security, so I'll first answer by security from an end user perspective, because usability is really fundamental. The entry access to any crypto environment by default, it still remains a wallet, right? So it's how you get in, is like you log in with a wallet. Now, the challenge with that is that it feels like there is a trade-off between how usable is the wallet and the login versus actually how secure it is. And the beauty of actually how Near has been built is that now you can say, yes, I want, maybe for one of the wallets, you want something that is, a bit less secure because it's almost like a login password that you could recover over email. So you can do that. Or you could say, well, actually, you know what? I want maximum security and I want to go cold storage and I want to be able to have like a ledger key or whatever. But then the implementation of what's been enabled is also to say, well, you could also program that maybe I trust 5 of my friends and my bank. And therefore, if something happens to me, I need at least 2 of my friends and my bank to unlock what's happening. And I think that's the next frontier of security, because the reality, and I say that also coming from having worked in a bank, the reality is that we trust banks because we say, well, I give them my assets, and then I also trust that they will really make sure that it's me when I come back, and that therefore they can really give me back what I have. And in crypto or in Web3, we say, well, not your keys, not your money, which is fine, but that comes at a cost of like, well, how do I make sure that I still have that? And if something happens to me, touch wood or whatever, but let's say I have an accident and I forget certain things, like how do you still get through like the things that are needed? And I think that's really, from a user perspective, the next frontier of what's needed for security. Now, if I think of, maybe it's a slightly different angle, but also very important, security at, for example, a protocol level, or actually security for everything we build. Well, one of the keys is actually open source. The belief in open source is super important because it's not only, one person coding and therefore his or her bias is being put into that, and therefore also his or her thoughts being put into that, but it's actually a community that is able to do that. We have bug bounties program that are actually open. We think that's also a great way to engage and to have, consistency and making sure that the code is continuously open. I think in the wallet space in particular, that's where open source is fundamental, right? Because ultimately, why would you trust this or that wallet if it's not actually, the code hasn't been reviewed, but it's also on an ongoing perspective being reviewed. So yeah, so those are some elements of how we think about those topics.
It's really a weight-off, right? Like we're having a lot of these cases within crypto right now because people are anonymous, or there's like some kind of hole within the system, and then you have these rug pulls happening within the NFT space, or we see all over the place. And it's interesting because we want to have an open source methods, but privacy is such an important thing for users and developers as well. And I'm wondering, does Near implement badges or credentials? Or like you mentioned, for example, that let's say you have a really high asset, you have all your Ethereum, you might want to have that in a cold wallet, but then you have your everyday NFTs that you might want to show to your friends or something. So yeah, I would love to know what you think.
Yeah. So excellent question. And that's exactly, so the vision we have with, for example, the blockchain operating system, and when you go on alpha.near.org, is exactly that, right? So imagine actually reinventing how we interact with each other, but what is actually the public profile that you put forward, and therefore your collection of, NFT, but also the connections of how you react and post and what you do and what you say, and therefore that being, your identity, and therefore that being also, upvoted or downvoted, but as a coder, equally important, right? Let's say if on alpha.near.org you build certain widgets, then that's also how you actually, gain points and gain aura within that community, which is a little bit, I guess how it's done in GitHub, but not on, not necessarily like in a Web3 mindset. So that's absolutely how we think and how things evolve. And that's, if you check alpha.near.org, that's some of the experience that you can start getting and seeing, like, what does that mean and what is there for that identity. We also think it's, I think we are at a turning point in history when we think of like, what's the source of content, right? Where does this information come from? And how do you actually trust that information, and who wrote that and who created that? And I think we're going to see even more paradigm shift in terms of, is it AI generated? Is it human generated? Is it trusted human generated? Is it not? Does it actually match T's and C's of a certain, front end. So I think, that's where those things become more and more important in a world where we are overloaded with information. We need to trust what's coming from certain places and to actually have certitude of what the source of information is, and balancing that actually with privacy, as you were talking about before, and balancing those two things. Yeah.
Yeah, the last part I think is really, really important, because even with us within the company, we talk about, okay, like how much can we use AI or how much can we utilize AI? But then, for example, for content or all these things, how much do we want to use AI? Because there's also a human aspect to it, to creativity and creating things. And that should be an original kind of, it's a really complicated question. And I want to know from you, Marieke, what are the things that in the ecosystem right now you're most focused on, the projects, in which kind of category do they fall? And yeah, what are the things that you're looking forward to within 2023?
Yeah, so 2023, it's really an exciting year for us, because we are seeing a lot of all those building blocks that have been happening across the ecosystem to come to fruition and actually to be realized, right? So this idea of the blockchain operating system that I mentioned is actually extremely exciting, because we can finally see, for users, portability of what we do, and for developers, actually this true Lego block building enabling happening. So that's one place where we're actually extremely excited. The other part, I would say, thanks to the usability of NEAR, we are seeing actually a lot of Web2 startups, Web2 projects that are coming on and, are looking at, how do they build their first products on Web3. And we're also extremely excited by that, because I think here are two things that we're seeing that remind me a little bit of what we saw with Web2. One is actually gaming totally transformed, the birth of actually the internet, but two, this transition Web1 to Web2, gaming completely transformed that. And there is no reason not to think that actually gaming is going to do the same thing for Web3. And so on that aspect, we're seeing a ton of things, and it goes from learn to earn in a gaming way, walk to earn in a gaming way, but actually proper Web3 native games that are Web2 that evolve into Web3, games that are completely indie games. And so I think that whole area is absolutely definitely fascinating, and there is quite a lot to see on that front. The other thing that we are seeing, which I think is also very interesting, right now there is no corporate in the world, or very little, that don't have a head of Web3 or a head of metaverse. I don't know how people want to call it, but that also reminds me of the area of the chief digital officer, or the team that was on the side that was looking at digital innovation. And those teams generally start by being a little bit on the side, and they're a lab, or they try and they innovate, but then they start becoming more and more embedded into the businesses. So that's another trend that we're seeing that actually is, if anything, is absolutely not slowing down, it's accelerating. And the last part I would say, which I'm really excited about, in 2022, I think a lot of projects, and us included, did purely grants, because it was a bull market, and in a bull market you just need to attract talent, to entice them to actually work on your chain so that they can create lasting value on it. But what we're seeing in the bear market is that it's actually not just having founders have a bunch of tokens so they can start implementing their project. It's actually much more, what's the knowledge that is needed for a project to succeed? And so we're launching a project we call Near Horizon, which is an accelerator. So it's you need actually access to what are the legal knowledge you need. How do you do your tokenomics? How do you do your go-to-market? How do you pitch to actually backers so that then you can have your first check, and so on and so forth. And that I'm also really excited about, because that's how the quality of project we're starting to see come on Near, and the builders that we're seeing come on. Granted, we are in a market where times are tough, and there is layoff in Web2, and it's a difficult market, but actually that's also enabling better, stronger talent to want and to come to build. And we are definitely seeing that. So I'm also extremely excited by that, and making sure they have the right resources, and it's not just finance resources, but actually all the resources that they need to build the projects and the dreams that they have, I think is really important.
Totally. And that goes back to usability and, brands and all these. I see it with fashion brands. They don't have any tools. They don't know what's going on. They come from traditional fashion, maybe. And it's so interesting to see. But we had collections or collaborations, I would say, with gaming platforms and different things really exciting because, you know, we always as a species has to move forward and we have to keep creating something original or interesting. I would love to know from your perspective, like looking ahead, do you think we're going to see more and more of this overlap of like brands kind of like having all different kinds of compartments and being part of gaming? And what do you think?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see, and I agree with you, I think we are seeing a ton of, for example, fashion brand, retail brands looking at it. And it makes total sense, right? Because it's like the convergence of a creator economy, but also how do you actually reward your users in a different way, right? So for example, loyalty is a very big area, right? Because loyalty, how do you build loyalty programs that are, you know, portable, that also like put, you know, the rewards back in the hands and that as a brand you can own end to end, right? So I think we are seeing like a ton of things that are in that area. And so I think it will be really interesting to continue seeing the evolution of that. And, you know, the emergence you're talking about, like the flux between it feels like it's a bit of gaming, it's a bit of loyalty, it's a bit of different things. I think, you know, the real, what's the killer user case is still being looked at. And I think it's a little bit of like trial and error. The other point you mentioned, which is also very important, is that all the different brands, you know, participating in Web3 is operationally very different, right? So let's say you're a Web2 company, you have a CFO, you have a head of ops, and you have a certain way to do digital business and so on, and you know how to operate that. Now participating in Web3 becomes different. It's like, okay, you have assets. How do you log them on a balance sheet? Like, what is an NFT? How do you record that? How do you actually put that in the hands of users and so on and so forth? So I think 2023, we're probably going to see more and more of this proof of concept and test and learn with brands. And then it will mean that we have playbooks and we are able to say, okay, this really works. And not only does it work for the end users, but it also works for the brands. And they're able to find new revenue streams that actually, you know, are fair, better share, and they can actually share that back with their users, right? So I'm really excited by that. And yeah, maybe it's convergence of everything. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you so much for your take on that. Hopefully we're going to see more collaboration and also usability and things that make a lot of sense. And yeah, thank you so much, Marieke, for joining us today on NEWFORUM. We would also love to know where our audience can check out NEAR and read everything about. If you have some recommendations for us, now is the time.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. Great question. It was a fantastic conversation. Too. So if you want to know more about NEAR, check near.org. You can also check the alpha version of what I mentioned, the blockchain operating system, on alpha.near.org. And then, of course, Twitter at NEAR Protocol is where you can actually learn more about NEAR.
Amazing. We're going to link everything down below, and we can't wait to see you guys in the next episode. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure to like and subscribe and check out NEAR, and we see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you.